when I was invited, I actually was debating if I'm going to give a specialized talk on subject within the context of 1919 revolution, and I thought of the relation of United States and 1919 revolution, which I already wrote a book about this relation after a long study, which will be published within a couple of months in Egypt. But then it came the agreement that I should talk about something general for the general audience, because there are many historians today who are going to speak about very specific topics. So my topic today is the Egyptian Revolution, a great event in the history of modern Egypt. Modern Egypt started in 1805 when Muhammad Ali became the ruler of Egypt, and he actually built a big army and fought 2 wars against Turkey, and he was victorious in both talks, and he was about actually to occupy Istanbul, but the big powers in Europe intervened, and the London Treaty was signed, which forced Egypt to be confined to its boundaries and to become an independent country with a nominal link to the Ottoman Empire, and Egypt should pay an annual tribute to Turkey every year. And for many years, the next generation of the dynasty of Muhammad Ali, finally in 1882, the British occupied Egypt for reasons outside this topic today. And many years after the occupation, in 1914, the First World War was declared, and with the declaration of the war, Britain declared that Egypt became a protectorate, a British protectorate. In 1917, USA joined the war with Britain and France, and the end of the war in 1918, Germany and Turkey alliance was defeated, and in Paris the powers met to formulate the first agreement of after the war. What is protectorate? It's a very vague term, but it means that Britain represents Egypt in foreign policy. Egypt cannot have a foreign ministry or embassies or consulates anywhere. The foreign missions in Egypt will present their credentials to the higher commissioner, British higher commissioner. Army, police, and finances of Egypt was totally under the control of the British. However, the Egyptians could form a cabinet with a prime minister to run other affairs of the country. Following the revolution, following the First World War, Egypt did a lot in the war to help Britain and the Allies. There were, in the next one of the speakers, Dr. Anderson will talk about this part. A large number of Egyptian farmers were actually drafted in the army as workers, and many of them died during these trips in Palestine, Syria, Europe, etc. And Egypt supported the British with lots of food and everything during this war. So Egypt demanded independence at the end of the war. And on November 13, Saad Zaghloul with Abdelaziz Fahmy and Ali Sha'rawi met the British High Commissioner, and they asked for a permit to leave to London to meet with the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister to ask for cancelling this protectorate issue and the self-rule of Egypt. The request was rejected by the British government, and Zaghloul went to talk to the people, speaking in different meetings. They prevented many meetings, the British Army in Egypt, but he could talk to smaller groups. There were lots of press campaigns, distributed pamphlets, and he could collect 2 million signatures from the Egyptians that he is the one who is representing the Egyptian people. The population at that time was a little more than 13 million Egyptians. And this is Saad Zaghloul at that period. Britain refused to negotiate with Saad Zaghlul and claimed that he is not authorized in this. And on March 8, 1919, the British forces arrested Zaghlul, and he was exiled to Malta, a small island in the Mediterranean. And this news became known all over Egypt. So March 9, 1919, the Egyptian revolution started. Actually, it started by students of the universities in Egypt, started by the law school, and other schools followed. Then the high schools joined, the people in the street also joined. The demonstrations that day was peaceful. However, the British arrested 400 students on that day. You could see here one of the tramways of Cairo where the demonstrators were jumping over the trail. Next day, demonstrations became much more vigorous. Al-Azhar Islamic University joined demonstration. Major demonstrations all over. Public transportation stopped completely. Banks and shops were closed. Violence started, and a number of martyrs occurred on that day. And as you see, one of the pictures of the violence which occurred on that day. The revolution continued for the coming days with major demonstrations by the workers who joined, mainly railway workers, and then the lawyers had their strike, and for the first ever women's demonstration in Egypt was on the March 16. And these are the veiled women demonstrating, and again, this is a big demonstration of all these women, veiled women, in 1919 on that day. This is Safia Zaghlul, Saad Zaghlul's wife, who already took off her scarf, and she had the Egyptian flag at that time. In March 18, Cairo became completely isolated. Major demonstrations in Alexandria. Total chaos in all governors. Railways, telegrams, post services were completely disrupted, preventing communications between different parts of Egypt. Huge revolt by farmers all over Egypt, and this will be again talked on by Dr. Anderson. And these are the major demonstrations which occurred at that time, to the extent that a small town in Lower Egypt in Delta announced an independent republic, a small town, when a group of students started demonstration. They were supported by Yusuf Gendi, who was an activist, and the local police cooperated to form this independent state, which lasted for a number of days. They disrupted connection to the rest of Egypt. They collected even taxes and started to organize local things. This Yusuf Gendi, the leader of Zefta, later on, when he became a member of the parliament in the elections few years later. The revolt continued extensively all over Egypt. Police stations were burned, railway services were completely disrupted, major funerals with hundreds of thousands of participants, and the number of martyrs was quoted by the British to be between 800 and 1,000, and according to Al-Rafi, the Egyptian historian, it is 3,000, and they included Muslims, Copts, and the Jews. And this is a major demonstration, as you see here, the crescent and the cross in one of the demonstrations. And this is the American flag. Egyptian demonstrating wants the support of the United States in the fight with the British. And that happened also in front of the Italian and French embassies or consulates. There were no embassies at that time. It was only consulates. And the Copts played a very important role in the revolution. Copts from all strata of the society joined from day one. Priest Sergius was the star, giving speeches in mosques, churches, and everywhere. Demonstrations all carried cross and crescent, signifying unity. And this is Priest Sergius who is a very well-known figure in the 1919 revolution. Copts, among the leadership of the Wafd party, there were 7 Copts out of 15. ويسا واصف بطرس غالي سينوت حنا نجيب اسكندر ويليام مكرم عبيد فخري عبد النور and George Khayat. And this is again one of the demonstrations clearly shown. The British asked Semeka Basha, the founder of the Coptic Museum, to explain this phenomena, which they couldn't believe, and they didn't count on that this solidarity between Muslims and Copts. The answer was Zaghlul is secular in thought. He never discriminated against Copts, and he has pledged to abolish any differences between Muslims and Copts. Later on, the women met in St. Marcus Hospital in Cathedral in Cairo, and they invited Muslim women to boycott the mission of Milner, who was Minister of Colonies during his visit to Egypt, and they planned another large women's demonstration in January 1920. And again, the Copts, including the Vice Pope and the major Coptic figures, both from the church and from the public, they met together in St. Marcus Cathedral to protest against appointment of Yusuf Basha Wahba as Prime Minister. At that time, Egyptians said, we will not appoint anybody as a Prime Minister and we'll leave this post vacant. And when Yusuf Wahba accepted, the opposition mainly came from Copts. After this massive change in Egypt, Britain had to change Sir Wingate, who was the General Commissioner, by General Allenby, who arrived the 25th of March, to find that Egypt is boiling and the situation is totally out of control. And this is General Allenby. In April 7, Britain decided to calm down the situation in Egypt, to free Saad Zaghlul from Malta and let him go to Paris to present the Egyptian case in front of the conference in Versailles Conference in Paris. The Egyptians had major demonstrations in Cairo, very happy celebrating the release of Zaghlul. Allenby ordered investigations for the cause of the revolution, and he provided positive response to reasonable demands of Egypt. But the Egyptians responded by new demonstrations. We want freedom. There were many trials following that, death penalty for many Egyptians, and long-term imprisonment for many people in different parts of Egypt. In Paris, Zaghlul and El Wafd failed to meet people in the Congress. Wilson, the President of America, refused to meet Zaghlul, and he previously, in his famous 14 points, he announced that all occupied countries should have freedom and we support self-independence and rights, etc. But Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of England, convinced him not to support Egypt. So he did not support cancelling the protectorate, and he supported that the protectorate will continue. Saad Zaghlul and his group continued to stay in Paris, talking to journalists, to members of the parliament in France, in England, and they also wanted to go to Washington. During that time, the Minister of Colonies, Milner, came to Egypt, and Saad Zaghlul asked Egyptians to boycott him in Egypt. So nobody wanted to see him, and he only met few officials, but the people absolutely refused to meet him. And then Lord Milner wrote a report to the British government that it is necessary to provide something satisfactory to the Egyptian people. It cannot work anymore. Agreement with Egyptian Sultan and the ruling elite will not be enough. Egyptians insist on abolishing protectorate and get their independence. Egyptian nationalists are not against Britain, but we must reach an agreement with Egypt, which reserves the interests of Britain, tribunal courts, and the privileges for the foreigners. Egyptians did not accept, and they wanted to cancel. And he told the Egyptian government, the British government, that you will turn Egypt to another Ireland with a continuous fight if we do not reach an agreement with Egypt. At that time, the Saad Zaghloul and his group met with some of the senators who were in Paris with President Wilson, and they wanted them to support Egypt in the fight. So they advised him to appoint Joseph Folk, who was the governor of Missouri, elected governor of Missouri, and finished his term, worked as a lawyer in New York. So he became the Egyptian attorney to represent Egypt in the press in America, and also to defend the rights of Egypt in the Senate. And he did a great job. This is Joseph Folk. Mohamed Mahmoud Basha was one of the group with Saad Zaghloul, traveled to Washington. It was very difficult. It took 3 or 4 months to have a visa, because Britain pressed the United States and France not let the Egyptians go to the United States. But finally, they reached Washington, and the position of the Senate was really excellent. I mean, when you read all the debates, minutes of the debates on the Senate, it was really fantastic. And they voted positively for Egypt, but unfortunately, it needed 2/3 majority. They had a just simple majority, which is not enough to pass the law. And the same applied for agreeing to the Versailles Treaty. The Senate did not approve the Versailles Treaty also with the same percentage of votes. This is Mohamed Mahmoud Basha. Then finally, for the first time, Britain realized that they have to talk to Saad Zaghloul. That was more than 2 years after the start of the revolution. So they asked Saad Zaghloul to come to London for a negotiation, and they had a negotiation there. Britain presented a proposal. It was rejected by Zaghloul. The Egyptian made another proposal. It was rejected by Britain. And then Britain presented a third proposal with some compromises. Saad Zaghloul in Paris had a meeting with the group to discuss it, and he came up with the idea that Egyptian people should decide what they want. So he sent some of the people from Paris to Egypt with this proposal. They went in Cairo in different governors. They discussed the issue of this, and the final conclusion that the Egyptian people accepted that proposals with some reservation. They want clearly that the term of the word protected to be cancelled, that complete independence of Egypt should be clearly mentioned in the agreement, the independence of Egyptian foreign policy. Egypt must have a new constitution and new elected parliament, and they accepted that Britain could protect the Suez Canal area, and they did not agree that Sudan will be an issue only for England. They said that Egypt must be also in that. Anyway, Al-Wafd arrived in London with this proposal of the Egyptians. There was no reply from the British government. They didn't like, and they didn't answer. Zaghloul went back to Egypt. After 2 years in France, there was a historic reception in Egypt. This is Zaghloul in his car, and the police around him on horses. And a new cabinet of Adli Yakan was formed, went to England, negotiated a possible settlement, and it didn't work. So Saad Zaghloul announced that we will fight for liberation. And they asked Zaghloul and all the leaders to retire to their villages and they refused to do that, so all of them were arrested, and the Egyptians decided to boycott the British completely in all subjects, goods, banks, companies, people, everything. And people, the leaders met in Zaghlul's home on the 28th of December. And these are the massive demonstrations supporting Zaghlul at that time. And on December 29, the British decided to exile Zaghlul for the second time in Seychelles Islands in the Indian Ocean. And after the exile of Zaghlul, there were arrests of all activists, continuation of unrest in Egypt. Then assassination started of all 4 prime ministers. There were a trial of assassination. None of them was died for, but some people were hurt, and then they started to assassinate British employees, and so it became a big mess in Egypt again. And finally, Britain had to give in, found out that it is impossible to continue this way, so they announced it without any negotiations that the unilateral declaration on the 28th of February 2019-22, abolishing of the protectorate state in Egypt, declaring Egypt as an independent country with some reservations. Britain is responsible to defend Egypt, Suez Canal and communication, and protect foreign citizens and foreign assets, and Egypt should not interfere in Sudan. The outcome of this very important declaration was Egypt appointed immediately a minister of foreign affairs. Egypt inaugurated embassies and consulates all over the world. British sub-ministers, all the British sub-ministers which were controlling everything in the ministers, were replaced by Egyptians, and a committee of 30 members drafted a new constitution, and it included Muslims, Copts, and 1 Jew, this constitution was really liberal, secular, and supported freedom of religion, freedom of opinion, and freedom of press. Zaghlul was released on the 27th of March, returned to Egypt. Parliamentary elections was done. Al-Wafd won 90% of the seats of the parliament, and Zaghlul became the prime minister in January 28th, 1924. All political prisoners were released, and this is again celebrating that victory. 1919 revolution had lots of achievements apart from this. They abolished the protectorate, they made independence, liberal constitution, and elected parliament. However, they have more than that. The base of Egyptian nationalism and detachment from the Ottoman and the Islamic slogans of the Ottoman Empire, which lasted for many years, Egypt became a different country. And equality between Egyptians, irrespective of color, religion, or race, liberation of women. Women removed the veil following that period and demonstration. Major change in education and cultural revolution. A new economic ideas and development of industry. And finally, this is Saad Zaghlul in the train leaving Egypt to meet the Prime Minister of England outside 10 Downing Street. That was Ramsay MacDonald, who was the first Labour Prime Minister in the history of England, meeting Zaghlul as 2 Prime Ministers to discuss the future Egyptian-British relations. Thank you, Zaghlul. Thank you, our grandparents who fought for the liberation of Egypt, and thank you very much. I don't know which was organized by Khediwi Tawfiq, and started in end of 1913.